This is the Pacific PowerShell User Group. We meet the second Wednesday of every month to talk PowerShell and other fun. Please join us. This is the second PowerShell or Pacific PowerShell User Group. We're here with Anthony Howell to talk PowerShell and .NET. We're here every second Wednesday of a month. Next month, we're going to be talking with Bruce Payette on Braid, which is going to be pretty awesome. But this month should be pretty great too. Anthony, you want to take us away?
Yeah, let me share my screen here. All right, can you guys see my screen? I need to make this full screen.
Looks excellent.
All right. So before I get started, I want to warn everybody that based on our conversations, we've got sounds like we have some pretty advanced folks on the call. I'm going to be hitting some basic topics. So you might some of you might enjoy relaxing for the first, 20 or 30 minutes. But anyway, tonight I want to talk about PowerShell and .NET, so using .NET types in PowerShell. And all of the content that I'll be sharing, I've got in the repository listed here on GitHub, so GitHub/thePoshWolf/sessions. So I go by PoshWolf online. And the opening slide that James asked me to include is this one.
Also, I'm just going to guilt trip a couple people here. Chris, you definitely could totally give a talk on some of that certificate or high availability stuff. That'd be great. And Gilbert, it sounds like you might also have some amazing stuff to share. So if anybody else has other things they want to get in the docket, let me know. And we're going to welcome Ivanhoe here.
Great. So yeah, just to recap.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
It's okay. I think we just had a new participant. Welcome to the meeting.
Cool.
We are just getting started here, but we are in presentation mode.
Cool. Just to recap what James was saying, every second Wednesday of every month, we've got a meetup page. There's a link in the slide deck. If you're interested in speaking, reach out to the organizers, who are James and Chris, right?
James and Chris, and also Jordan Hammond and Jeremy Watkins.
Sweet.
We've got too many calls.
Well, at least you won't all burn out that way.
Yes, that's
hopefully.
The idea.
So every month has a speaker and a discussion topic that is both broadcasted and recorded. And so this month, I'll be talking about PowerShell and .NET. So just really quick, who am I? I go by the PoshWolf online. In real life, if you run into me, I'll tell you my name is Anthony Howell. So I'm based out of Eugene, Oregon, so definitely solidly in this region, the Pacific, for the Pacific PowerShell User Group. I've got almost 4 kids, 2 dogs, a wife, and a cat. So if you heard me joke about, a week and a half, I'll be worrying about a baby. That was the honest truth. And so I've been in IT, 12 years now, PowerShell since 2012, started with V2. If any of you have used V2, I'm sure you can appreciate what 7 is.
Way.
Yeah, I actually, let's see, was it end of last year, maybe beginning of this year, I did a project that had to, I did a PowerShell project that had to work in backwards compatible to V2 in an incident response scenario. And I'm
sorry.
Relearned how to appreciate even PowerShell 5.1. That was very painful. But
yeah.
These days, I work for a company called Evolent, running their DevOps organization, healthcare software. We're being recorded, so I won't say too much, except, healthcare software, so we're kind of old school, unfortunately, but modernizing. I have a blog. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter, Blue Sky, Reddit, a lot of other places, but I really hate social media, so I'm not out there much. If you've never heard of me, not surprised. But I do post occasionally. Okay, so tonight, it's a quick overview. We're going to cover, I'm just going to click through all this really quick and then talk through it. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover in order. So understanding types in PowerShell. This is going to be the abbreviated version. How you can discover types, import them, use them, and then using understanding generics, and then other places that .NET types can be used. And this is all going to be from the perspective of PowerShell. So this is not an introduction to C#. Though reading documentation for a lot of stuff involves understanding that at times.
Okay.
Yeah. And but very importantly, if you guys have questions, hit the raise your hands, say something else. I got 2 screens here, so I do have Teams up. I will be able to see it. So
Cool.
that's it for slides.
So don't be shy.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get into this.
Oh, okay. So that was it for slides, and we're all into demo now. All right. I love it.
Yes. Yeah. Slides are fun, but only executives really care about them because they can't read code. Okay.
All right.
So I'm working in VS Code, PowerShell 7, and in fact, we were talking about the warning earlier. I probably get that every time because I'm on 7.3.7. I think what was the latest 7.3.9. So anyway, what I want to do is run through just to make sure we're all on the same page for what a type is in PowerShell, right? So like I mentioned, a lot of this is going to be basic, but it sets the foundation for what we're going to get to here. So in PowerShell, we have a lot of built-in types, right? So strings, for example. Yeah, slides are fun, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, dude, I make this module start demo or show demo. You could have a type for you. But yeah, go.
I'll look into that.
Yes.
All right. So in PowerShell, if you're not familiar, every type has the get type method on it. So for example, if we're looking at string, it's going to tell us that it's a string. And if we have an integer, right, the number 42 answer to everything, this also is going to return an integer. But specifically, we got Boolean. So let me get through all the examples. We got some Boolean. So these are all .NET types. So even though they are built-in types to PowerShell, since PowerShell is built in .NET, the moral of this story is that these are all just .NET types. And we can look at the full name, for example, and see the fully qualified name, system.datetime. And this is going to be really useful when we start looking at imported types. And even hash tables are, yes, life, the universe, and everything. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That was yeah.
Yeah.
Even hash tables, if you're coming from C#, hash table is just a dictionary, essentially, but in PowerShell we call it a hash table. Don't ask me what the differences are. I'm not that familiar with C# to be able to explain that. And then PS custom objects, using the type accelerator here, we got property value, and then of course this type is the PS custom object.
That one's a squirrely one, actually. That's not. Yeah, it's not actually a different thing than PS objects, but it's treated differently by PowerShell. Also, on a more helpful refrain note, one of the things I come back to in PowerShell all the time, like explaining to others, is everything is an object in PowerShell, and then I run through stuff like this. Absolutely everything is an object, whether you think about it as one or not.
Yeah, and that's exactly the summary of this first section. Is everything's an object, or I'm calling them .NET types, but in .NET, which is an object-oriented language, it's all objects. And so we can even look at get process, and this itself is an object, right? It's a .NET type. It's the system.diagnostics.process. We can see down at the bottom. And at this point, we can look at directories, and directories are system.io, directory info. But one thing that is true across all objects or all .NET types and all commandlets in PowerShell is you can use git member. I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with git member. We can use that to look at the methods and properties on any type in PowerShell, even imported types, and we'll see that. And so I have very, very repetitive lines here. We can look at all of them, but it's unless we want to look through each of them, it's not that exciting. And we'll look at a couple examples here further down.
Cool. Questions,
All right.
comments, thoughts? Anybody got anything? Bueller?
Cool.
All right.
Cool. We'll move on. So there's a lot of different ways we can create objects. So in the previous example, in the previous script, we were looking at, creating strings with, putting characters inside of quotes, creating integers by inputting numbers. But for more complex types, like a get date, like a datetime object, we can use like the command like get date, right? And this is as we saw earlier, a datetime. And same thing for making like a directory info object, which is what get item spits out. And this is the directory that I'm in right now, and of course directory info. And then we can do the same thing with get process. We create that type with get, we can create the process object with get process. In line 14, we can create a command info object with get command. And this is actually a legitimate command, line 14, get command, get command.
Mm-hmm.
And that itself is the command info type. But there's another way we can also create objects or types in PowerShell using the new object commandlet. And here you can see I'm actually passing an argument list of the year, month, day, and this itself creates a datetime object for today. But the interesting thing is, how do you know what to pass for the argument list? And same thing for creating a directory info object. So you notice here I've got the fully qualified name of this .NET type.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I actually specifically typed in, here, let's run this. This works. I'm not actually sure if this will work without, and it does not. So we have to specify the fully qualified name of the type.
Yeah, you can always avoid the system namespace. That's one of my bugbears with PowerShell use. Almost, at least. I don't remember if it works with the new object type name, so I'm kind of curious if I'm wrong here.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point, because datetime, fully qualified, is system.datetime.
Yeah.
So you're saying, can we do it without the system dot?
Yeah. That system dot is your default namespace. And that, for me, just saves 7 characters of typing. My fingers are getting old. They don't want to type 7 more characters every time they don't need to. So I tend to do it because it makes my scripts a little shorter. In various versions of PowerShell, it's actually been faster, but that's very, 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 very inconsistent and has no logical reason it should be.
Code golf, love it.
So yes. So, go on.
All right, so the default namespace. Thank you. I didn't actually realize that. And so for creating a process, for example, using a new object, we don't even need to pass an argument list. So you can see here I can actually create a new process object that has no reference to any existing process by not passing an argument list.
There is no process.
Yeah. And if I want to create a command info object, here on line 25, I can't even do that with new object. So let's figure out why this is. Now, and before we get into that, I'm almost skipping a whole other section. The third way that we can create objects in PowerShell is using this syntax of calling the different types. So here inside of the square brackets, we have the fully qualified namespace of a type. And I'm guessing we can probably drop system. We'll try that here. And then using double colons, we then will pass the method name here. In this case, in this example, this is not a non-working example. It's just to emphasize the different parts of it here. So we got method, and then inside of the parentheses, we actually pass the parameters. So for datetime, for example, we are using the new method, which is the constructor, which we'll explain here in a second, and passing and running this with these same parameters as before, and it creates a datetime object. And then same thing with directory info, right? And we'll here let's drop system and show that this even works without the system namespace.
Yep.
Cool. And then it's going to be the same thing with process and with command info as well, except as before, command info fails. So how do we find out if a type has a constructor? So datetime itself is a runtime type, and the runtime type can also be passed to getMember. So we saw previously how we could pass all different types of objects to getMember, so we can pass runtime type to as well. And so we can do that, and we're not going to look at all of these, but one of these methods here is getConstructors. If I can remember my alphabet here. So getConstructors. And so we can run that method and see that we get some output here. And we're not going to parse all of these. I'm going to show you an easier way to understand these methods. But if we look at the .name property, they're all .ctor, which is the abbreviation for constructor. And if we look at the command info type, for example, so that failed when we tried to create it. It doesn't have any constructors.
Yeah.
And so someone more familiar with C# might be able to explain why, but it's my understanding it's a private type, or it's a type that doesn't have a declared constructor. And
well, let's get abstract. It is an abstract type.
Oh, there we go.
Other types in PowerShell inherit from it. So you'll have like a commandlet info, which is a proper C# compiled commandlet. And you'll have a function info, which is a function, or alias info, or external script info, or application info. These are all subclasses of command info. But command info, I believe, is abstract. And for bonus points, actually, you should be able to copy and paste that type down onto the command line and say dot is abstract. And I think it'll tell you it's true. And the thing about abstract types is that, well, they're abstract. They're not meant to really ever actually exist.
There we go.
So that is why. And bonus points of PowerShell, that is yet another example where you can just explore .NET types in PowerShell really easily and figure out why things are the way they are.
Yeah, I've actually started learning C# a couple months ago, and I still use PowerShell for type discovery.
Yeah, it's way better than C# for type discovery, in my very biased opinion.
Yeah.
But cool.
Okay, so if we know something has a constructor, how do we know what to pass to that constructor? Because we saw in the previous example, I could pass year, month, day to create a new datetime. So the easiest way that I found is passing the type itself, in the square brackets here, and then the method that you want to learn more about without any parentheses. And what this does, and I'm not going to pull up the console here. I've got this output already pasted in here. And what it does is it returns this list of all of the different overloads for the constructor, so all the different ways to run this method. And specifically, we will have the output, so the type that it outputs, as well as the method name, and then any parameters that it takes. So you can see this first parameter takes a long number of ticks. And the constructor that we were using here is this third one down, where we got int, year, month, day. And if we scroll down, we can guess that we can also create one with int, year, month, day, hour, minute, second. So there's a lot of different ways to create datetime. And that's not to say that any of these are better than using getDate. So I'm not advocating using this over getDate, but yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could briefly maybe explain the difference between a normal method and a static method.
That's a good one.
That would be better for someone who can explain the difference.
Okay. Do you want me to try?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sure James could, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Put me on the spot. Anyway, no, I was classically half educated. I dropped out. What The difference is that one is static and one is on the instance. So remember we talked about the concept of a type being abstract, right? Okay. Well, essentially a static method or property is a thing that exists without a single object ever existing. That's a weird way to put it, but it's as close as you'll get. Every other instance, every time that you're working with one of those, you're constructing it or something's building it for you and returning it to you. Like when we say datetime new, we're constructing an instance of a datetime. Then we have an actual datetime object. But before we had a datetime object, we might want to be able to work with the datetime class. And that's why you have static methods and properties, because sometimes you want to do something about a thing before or without respect to whether there are actually any of those things. I'm sorry, object-oriented design is kind of trippy when you get into stuff like static and abstract, but it is
I think
useful.
I think about an example using a static method. So let's get a little further, and then I want to see if I understand
you're
this.
at a great example right now. In fact, it's wonderfully named. You could have 1,000,001 instances of a datetime, but there's only one now.
Yeah, and yes, yeah. So now exists already without having instantiated a datetime object. But discovering the different methods, there's a couple of ways to do that. The way that I often do it is by simply typing the object with 2 colons and then just tabbing. So I'm hitting tab on my keyboard right now, and we can look at the different methods through here. So now, for example, we run that, we get it's the equivalent of get date.
Yeah,
but
we
can
1,000
also
times faster, and no joke there, literally.
L control spacebar. Let's try that. Oh, there we go. I always forget about that one.
Me
Thank
too.
you. There we go. Here we go. Or I'm gonna put this in here so we have it in the I have it in the code. Because I'm gonna forget about that one.
For posterity.
So down below, this is the output using control space, and we can tab through this. Yeah, using PS readline. I'm terrible about using PS readline. So like for instance today, and I was tabbing through those various options there. So another method, for example, is days and month. And if we run this like we did with new with no parentheses, it gives us all the different ways that we can run it. And in this case, you can see that this is a static method because it's got static here in the output.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes the year and the month. So if we want to say how many days are there in October of 2023, 31.
Yeah. Could you be cool for a second and pipe that to get member? The date, time, days, and month, not the output of it, just that one. Yeah. So this is kind of good to know. Any time you're dealing with methods in C#, static or instance, you can actually not just get this as output, but you can assign this to a variable, and you might notice that it has this handy method on it, invoke. So if you wanted to basically go look through all the methods available and invoke any of them with whatever arguments you want, well, this is how.
So what he's saying is that we can take this
Yep.
And that should, oh, hang on.
Not quite yet. It'll
say,
say I can't find an overload that has no, or 0 arguments. So yeah, that's handy to know. Handy to use.
Oh, here, let me actually put this
yes, and Ryan's got a wonderful example of where the date time static methods can be handy. In this case, date time offset.
Here, let's pull this in. And then we'll talk about enum values.
By the way, pro tip for future potential, speakers. Apparently, you can write the presentation entirely in code and make the presentation better during the presentation by taking, suggestions from chat. This makes this whole thing really easy. We should all do this.
So Ryan, these are good examples of static methods. Is that what you're saying?
The first one is not a static method. It's a method acting on the instance of now, the datetime offset now instance. But the second one is a static method that you can run against any old Unix time value. So it's not the second one doesn't require an instance of datetime offset to run against. You just run it. It's essentially a standalone function, like that just happens to be tied to the datetime offset class.
Yeah. And
Nice.
there are actually a lot of those in .NET because I don't remember who by name who was like, what's the difference between static and instance? The other really unprofessional answer is people put stuff in static methods because they think they might use it a bunch of other places, and they don't always. But it's where you'll reliably find I need to work with a number of these objects or a number of different types of objects, and I need to have a helper method somewhere, but I shouldn't have the helper method on instance because purist object-oriented reasons. So, static method? Static method. Okay.
Oh, or like me learning C#, they just follow or listen to the compiler when the red squiggly line shows up. This should be static. Oh, okay, let's make it static. Supposed to laugh at that.
That's a bad red squiggly line because now that explains why a lot of people end up static and don't need to be.
Yeah, probably.
Because I'm pretty sure if you just start off coding and you don't have anything instance related, it'll be like, this should be a static method. And I wasn't done yet. I was going to put some instance stuff in there.
All right. So getting back to the presentation here. So the last thing I wanted to walk through, or maybe there's one more. Yeah, this is the last thing. Is getting enum values. So a really good example. We're all familiar with the execution policy. So if we do a set execution policy and we say execution policy and we tab through this looks like if you want to be pure PowerShell, this looks like a validate set, right? But if we look at the help for set execution policy, specifically looking at the execution policy parameter. And let me make this a little bigger here. It tells us that the type that this takes is execution policy. So what's nice about auto-completed PowerShell is we can type just straight execution policy inside of square brackets, and I can just tab complete this to get the fully qualified name.
Do you want a cool trick here?
Yes.
All right. So suppose you just want to figure out what the possible values of an enum parameter are, okay? Can you give me more of the terminal to work with, or not terminal, editor window? That's where you're messing around with most stuff, right? Okay, so what you could do is you could say something like get command set execution policy dot parameters. I'm glad that you already know right where the parentheses need to go. But parameters execution policy would be bracket execution policy, though you could also do it with dot. And then you'll have, I believe, parameter type within there. That'll give you the parameter type. Okay, so that gets us 3/4 of the way there. Cool. Now there's a static method, again, on enum. A static method called enum get values. So if you put that whole thing as an argument to enum get values, you'll see all the values for that type. All in one line. So go to the front of the line and put some parentheses around that, or even go to that. You'd also have this. This would also work. There you go.
Cool. All right, so it's down below.
Everything's an object in PowerShell.
Nice. I do have another example where we compress things down to one line, so I'll remember that for next time. Okay. So we've discovered the fully qualified name, and if we look at it, here we go. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. But we can, in the terminal, we can use tab. We can probably use control spacebar. Yeah, and we can get all of the potential values or methods on this type. But if we want to get them using the type, we can do this here on line 114. If we have the type, there's a get enum names on it, or we can use this. We can do get command on the command itself. Look at the parameters, specific parameter, and then the type, and get enum names, just like James was just explaining.
Fantastic.
Ooh, .NET enums versus PowerShell native enums are also a thing. I'm not familiar with the difference between .NET enums and PowerShell native enums. I know that you can do both. What's the difference, Ryan?
Honestly, I wish I knew more. I just know that I've had weird compatibility issues in edge cases in some of my public modules where I originally made it with a .NET enum, I added a .NET enum as a add type with some raw .NET code, and it wasn't compatible in certain weird edge cases, and converting it to a PowerShell native enum made it compatible in some environments. It might have been related to constrained language mode. It might have been who knows. And so I don't really know where it's good to use one or the other, or why, but there are design considerations when picking which one to use. If you're creating your own enums, I should say. Most of the enums you'll end up using just that already exist are .NET enums.
That is good to know, and as much as I've been Johnny on the spot with additional information, that is something that is new to me. So, thanks.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, on to the next one. So let's talk about importing types. This is fairly straightforward. There's a commandlet for it, add type. And specifically, make sure you use the path parameter. I can't tell you how many times I've used add type, like here in this example, where I just add type and pass it, assuming there's a positional parameter for path, which there is not, and I get all these errors. So make sure you use path, and you could do this, in your PowerShell console. You can do this in a PSM1 file. So if you've got a module that depends on types, which is actually, so these are, I'm specifically pulling from, I've got a module for managing Discord that uses a .NET library. I'm just pulling all those DLLs into the session here. But another way to do this, and this is one I recently started using, is if you have a module that requires .NET types, you can use the required assemblies. Here, let's look at this. The required assemblies value in the manifest file itself. So this is another module that I'm working on. If anyone's into modding Bethesda games, this is a PowerShell module that lets you do that. But you can include.
You're coming back to talk about this when it's public. You know that, right?
It is public. It's an early version. I haven't done a lot of testing, but it's based on a library, so it should work, right? But the moral here is, if you've got a module that depends on types, you should put it in the manifest instead. And so what we're looking at here, so these are relative paths. So the module itself, so I've got it in this folder. It's called modify. The module, PSD1, and the manifest is the binary module, are in the same folder as the lib directory, which is where all the DLLs are. So relative path there. So if you're writing a module that depends on them, this is a good way to do this. And you could build a manifest using a build script or something, which is what this does. But I do want to emphasize, using add type still works. There's no, I haven't seen any outcome difference between them. So in both ways, yes. So Edgar's asking, do the DLLs hold functions? So in this case, it depends on what we're talking about. Here, let me bring this back over. So in this case, these DLLs are all supporting the libraries that my module depends on. So the module itself is written into C#. So this is me learning C# by writing a binary module. A little beyond, or I'm not to the point where I feel comfortable teaching somebody how to do that, and a little beyond tonight. But I'm gonna walk through an example where I'm using .NET types to actually build functions. So how do I enumerate the functions in them? So the types are all built into the DLL libraries.
Yeah.
Let me walk through. I got some good examples with the Discord.NET library. So let's walk through that. There's actually a good segue into this. So if you are importing a .NET library that's in a DLL and it's established and well used, always start with their documentation. That's going to be the best way to get started using any library if they have documentation, because discovery can be difficult and tedious. Trying to figure out what types do what, and especially if they're not named very well or there's a lot of types, it can be very tedious. So I'm going to walk through an example using the Discord.NET library or SDK. I use them interchangeably here. And this is an open source .NET library for interacting with Discord's API. So I've been working on a Discord PowerShell module that allows you to interact with Discord's API, and it's using this .NET library. So one of the things in the docs, and we're not going to look at the docs because it's not an advertisement for this library, just using it as an example, is they say to interact with their API, you start with a Discord REST client. So, as we saw before, I can take, this Discord REST client, I can type this into my terminal, I can hit tab, and I get the fully qualified name of that type, which is here on line 12. And so I know that I need to make one of these objects, and so I typically just use the new instead of new object, or sorry, new PS object. So line 16. So if I run this, I can see that I have two ways that I can run build one of these particular objects, and both of them output, are desired object types, the Discord REST client. One of them takes a Discord REST config. So if I look at that type, so here on line 20, I look at the constructor for it. The constructor doesn't take any parameters. So let's try making one. So here on line 24, I'm actually making them, calling it DRC. And if I look at DRC, we can see that in this particular case, these are just different settings that you can pass to the client. And again, we're not going to get into the specifics here. But since we are able to, and we'll look at the constructor for Discord REST client, since we are able to create one without any parameters, we'll go ahead and do that. All right, so line 29 here, I'm creating a new Discord REST client. And then if I look at the value of our newly created object, we get some nice output here. And so what do we do with this next? Well, we could look at the documentation, which is what I would recommend. But if we're not sure, we can pipe it to get member, which you end up using a lot in PowerShell. And one of the methods here, and there's quite a few methods. One of them is, let's see, there's logged in. Oh, sorry, I always forget my alphabet when I'm put on the spot. Login async. All right. So if we look at that method, we'll find out that it returns a task object. And I'm not going to go too deep on explaining, the asynchronous, how using asynchronous types and methods in C# works, but it passes you a task that you can then do things with to see the result. And it does it in the background. But this login async method takes a Discord token type, the token itself, and then validate token, and the default value. So this is how you specify a default value, or sorry, how the method tells you that it has a default value, kind of like setting a default value in a param block in PowerShell. So it's default to true, so we do not have to pass that third parameter. And I've got it notated here in the comments as well. So we've got the output type, the method, the required parameters, and then the parameter with a default value. So first thing we have to figure out is what is the Discord token type? So we can look at it here, and we can see I'm just flat out typing the type into PowerShell with the square brackets. We know it's an enum. Cool. So we can use our .getEnum names method. Great. We can see there's only 3 options here. So it's either a bearer token, a bot token, or a webhook token. And in this case, I already know I've already created a bot token to interact with the API. So I know that I know that I need to pass the bot token type, which is what I've done here on line 59. And I have smartly put my token not in the code, but I have put it in plain text on disk. Don't recommend this, but it was quick and easy here for the demo. So if I run line 59, regardless of how long that task takes, it returns immediately, passes me a task object, which I've assigned to the task variable. And if we look at that task, and again, I don't want to get too deep down explaining the asynchronous stuff because I'm not sure that I'm the right person to explain it. But we can already see that it is completed, and we can look at the various methods on here and various types. So if it errors, we can pull the errors out. But typically in PowerShell, if you need it to run synchronously, we're just going to run the wait method, which will wait until it completes. And you can specify, if we look here in the, well, actually, let's make this a little easier. If we look at the method itself, we can see that there's options to specify timeouts as well.
Cool.
So it's quite common just to run wait, even though we know it's already completed, and then to look at the result. However, in this case, we notice we got a void task result, so there is no result from running login async. It's a void return type. And so if we look at the client again, we can now see that it is actually logged in. Cool, and we can even look at the login state property, which is what the module actually does to find if it's logged in. And we can put that in a one-liner here on line 72. And I mean, it still works the same. And with enums, one trick you can do if we want to get back into talking about code golf is we can specify the enum value using as a string, and this will work just the same. So yeah. It's the same thing as if we pass the whole fully qualified enum.
One other quick thing to note is some enums are flags, and you can combine multiple values in there with commas. So if it was a flag, you could have bot comma bearer to be both a bot or a bearer.
Yes. So it essentially is an array inside of a string.
Yeah, close enough.
See what we're looking at here. All right, would this not be a valid expression? So from Edgar, so I'm not sure. I've not used this before, but in my experience, if you've got a .NET library that has a lot of types, it's not always very useful. I mean, you can. Well, let's try this out here. I think we've got. Well, I'm going to get off the rails a little bit. But if you're using a large .NET library, like is the case with this Discord.NET library, it's not very useful to see a huge output of all of the different object types. And that's where what I've found is that it's much better if they have documentation to read their documentation.
Yeah.
But
I would strongly agree with you, and the documentation is great to answer the question. Yes, that is a fine way to go ahead and discover types, is to load them up. The other one you can also do that's handy is you can basically ask a types assembly and then get the types from there, which is what you're doing. So the quickest version of that'll always work in PowerShell is like bracket psobject.assembly.get types. That's all the types in PowerShell. There you go.
And that'll be a nice long list, especially if you have some DLLs loaded. All right. Any questions on this? Doing a little bit of discovery and using some .NET types, well, specifically the Discord.NET stuff.
So these were DLLs written by developers at Discord for their .NET framework. Like they say, if you want to interact with Discord utilizing .NET, this is how you do it. You take those, import them into PowerShell. PowerShell natively supports that.
So these DLLs are community written and supported, and they're specifically designed for C#. You read their documentation; it's all targeted towards C#.
Okay.
Which is the case, for the vast majority of .NET libraries.
Okay.
And what I'm doing here is I'm just taking those types, importing them into PowerShell, and just using them in PowerShell.
Got it.
Which we can do, even if it was written specifically for C#. We could. PowerShell is built in .NET. All the stuff in PowerShell is .NET based, so we can interact with those types even if they weren't specifically designed for PowerShell, as long as they were written in .NET.
That's always good to know.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So then these types and everything are just a different way of abstracting what I imagine is under the hood, just interacting with Discord's REST API or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we
Okay.
let's look at login async, for example. We can go to Discord's API documentation and find the exact REST API call required to do this, and we could rewrite that in PowerShell with invoke REST method and do that instead if we wanted.
Got you. Okay.
Yeah.
But
this is just nicer.
It's not even a
different.
matter of nicer. Different is a good way to put it. There are tools you can use to automatically generate REST APIs in PowerShell. There are other libraries like this you could use. Any time that you're doing one or the other, you as a developer or scripter are saving yourself the time of having to write it all by hand. And your trade-off is the lack of control. That is, if there's something the Discord library doesn't do, well, you can't do it. All right? That's just part of development, though. You're taking a dependency, you can do what the dependency gives you for less, and the dependency can break on you. It's rare, and it should never happen, but that's the trade-off you're making. So, yeah. The thing of it is like, .NET as an ecosystem is still way larger than PowerShell, and so if I am a random company trying to expose my functionality, I'm more likely to expose .NET first, even as a prerequisite to exposing PowerShell. Very few companies are going to jump right to building a PowerShell experience. So where I find understanding PowerShell on .NET and working with them well helps is just in all of the C# world you can bring into PowerShell, basically.
Got it.
So essentially,
make sense?
it's shortcutting in a sense, but not in a bad way.
Yeah, it's a good shortcut. It's a useful shortcut.
Yeah. And one of the benefits that I found is if, like, let's say the API changes, and so they publish a new version of the library. Well, generally speaking, the functionality or the usage of the library won't change. It's just how it interacts with the API changes. And so all we have to do is update our DLLs and then republish a new version of the module. That's it.
Cool.
Gotcha. And so when you're publishing this module, are you packaging the DLLs in there as well, like you had there, where there's that file with lib DLLs, etc.?
Yeah. So we'll take a quick tangent here.
Sorry.
So in this specific library, and I'm meaning to go back and update this, but what I've done is I've downloaded the DLLs directly into my Git repository. In my build script, and I literally just rebuilt this laptop like a couple weeks ago, so I don't have. Let me see if I can build it really quick. All right. So it outputs it to the build directory, and it worked the first time. Great. Now inside this build directory, and this is what gets packaged up and sent to the PowerShell gallery. So I've got my typed file, my PSM1, which is where I've got all the functions, and we'll examine a little bit of this in a little bit. We've got my PSD1, and in this module, I don't use the required assemblies. I just figured that one out since I published this, and so in a newer version, I'll add that. And then what I'm doing in the PSM1 at the bottom is running I'm running this the same command we saw before, just add text, getting all the DLLs and adding them.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to point out one other quick thing here, two other quick things. One, add type has pass through. If you wanted to see all the types that it's loading, just add pass through. It's great. Number two is that you can also import module to bring in a DLL, kind of paradoxically, because it has to kind of load the DLL to figure out if it had commandlets in it, and if it had commandlets in it, then it will bring those in as PowerShell commands. But you can just import module blah.dll, and it will try to load it up as a .NET library. Unfortunately, not all DLLs are .NET libraries, though. So your mileage may vary. I personally prefer the add type, though, because pass-through is nice. And like if I'm just like starting to explore a new .NET ecosystem, I'll often basically go to wherever all the assemblies are, add type to import them all, and basically just start to explore. So, yeah. That's the way I rock it.
So does that answer the questions about why we're using the .NET library and how? I don't have a lot more examples of building a module with it. And hindsight, maybe I should have gotten more into that.
No, absolutely, that answers the questions. I think that was just my lack of understanding of .NET and C#'s relation to each other, and then that relation to PowerShell. Explaining that makes it make a lot more sense.
Yeah, the easy way to try to remember it is that .NET is a framework. C# is the language that framework is primarily built in and used with, but it's not the only language. PowerShell is another one of them. So everything you build in C# you should be able to use in PowerShell. It's not unfortunately true in a vice versa way, though. You can't just take PowerShell and turn it into C# quite so easily. Does that make more sense or less sense?
That does make sense, yeah. At my work, we've got a lot of C# on our actual dev team, and so I'm kind of familiar with that. I had to do some integrations of PowerShell graph stuff for them for a 365 license assignment and things, but they handled all of the translation of some type of basically creating a PowerShell object, and I think just running the invoke method on it and doing that to run PowerShell within C#. I think I'm not 100%, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and Ryan also mentioned in the chat that using required assemblies is generally accepted to be better. So I've added that link to the.
It makes a module easier to inspect, is what it does. It makes it easier for me to say, you as a module will definitely require these 4 or 5 assemblies. Now, if it's a maybe requires these 4 or 5 assemblies, then I'd look elsewhere. But if it's definitely, required assemblies is there for a reason.
Cool. All right. So, using. So, if you are familiar with C#, then I'm sure you're very familiar with the using keyword. So I actually had my browser's not even going to open. Where you at? Open the background.
Uh-oh. Oh, well.
Here we go. All right. This one. So this is just it's an example of the using in a C# file, a .cs file. And it tells the compiler what namespaces you're going to use. And we can do something very similar in PowerShell. It's slightly different syntax. So in PowerShell, we specifically, after the using keyword, which must come at the top of the file, the only things that can precede a using expression is comments. So you notice in this file, that's the only thing before us. Now, but we specifically want to say namespace and then specify a namespace. And as we saw earlier in the presentation, we can pretend as if we're already using the system namespace. This is our default namespace. But if we were to say using namespace system.io, what that means, I'm going to remember to load it in here, is that we can create a system.io directory info object, with the new constructor, which we saw. But if we have this using statement in here, we can save even more typing, and line 10 just reference the type directly. And so we can also, say namespace discord.rest and just create that new Discord REST client without specifying the fully qualified name. So it's a very common thing in C#, and something that may not use in PowerShell, but it can save you some characters, some typings if you got old man fingers like James.
Yeah, they are getting old.
All right.
It's all the clicking the thumbs up.
Nice. So generics. This is a very complex topic that I'm only going to scrape on to make sure because you may run into these if you're working with .NET types. So PowerShell is actually a very generic when it comes to typing. So for example, an array in PowerShell, you can create an array of non-similar objects or non-similar types. So for example, this array has a string, an integer, and a date time, and this is a valid array in PowerShell. Okay, and we look at the type of the array. So assign it to a variable there. Type it's just an object array, right? Okay. Full name system.object with the square brackets. And so since we have the fully qualified type name here, we can look at the constructor for it. We can look at some methods. So I have the add methods, for instance, and we get this ilist.add system.object.value. But you might be thinking, like, how do we know that the string, integer, and date time, how do those pass as system.objects? Because this obviously is an array that includes various objects. And this gets to do another concept that we're not going to fully explain here, but give you hopefully an understanding. But it's polymorphism in object-oriented languages, where if you look at, so the first item in this array is a string. So the type of the string is string, but the base type is system.object. So what that means is that it's inheriting all the methods and properties from the system.object base type. And we can look at integer as well. It also is inheriting from system.object. We can look at the date time, which also inherits from system.object. We can look at the client, which is our Discord REST client, and that inherits from the system.object as well.
Yeah, just like everything is an object in PowerShell, everything true is an object in C#.
Yes. And so using the concept of polymorphism, if we have a method, for example, this ilist.add method that takes a system.object, we can pass any object that inherits the system or inherits from system.object. So we can pass our string, we can pass our integer, we can pass the date time or the Discord REST client, anything, as long as it inherits from system.object, which I believe all types do.
They have to.
Yeah. Okay, all types have to. There you go. Cool. And so if we look at like a hash table, for example, I've got the link here. We're not going to get into the documentation because reading documentation is kind of boring. Hash table key value, right? So we look at we've already seen, the type here, system.collection.hash table. If we look at the new, creating a new one, it gets really complicated. So I'd say stick to, at symbol, curly braces. But if you look at the add method on a hash table, this is where we see that we can literally create a hash table that has any object as the key, any object as a value. It does not have to be string. It does not have to be string object. It can be anything.
Yeah, that can be very handy, actually.
Yes. So for example, we can get really crazy. Line 51, we can create an entry in our hash table where the key is our client and the value is our array. And so we look at our hash table, you can see now we have a key value for the first one, and then the Discord REST client, and then the array. So we can actually reference that with client and look at that array.
There you go.
So this is one of the things where, I've talked to, developers that are, big into C# and they're like, well, I should learn a real language. They hate this kind of stuff, where it doesn't matter what the types are. And so in C# or even in PowerShell, it's sometimes best practice to do this. Instead of creating an array, you create a list. So if you've ever tried to use the plus equals operator, stop. It's very inefficient. You should use a list instead. That's a whole other conversation. But a list, and we'll actually look at this documentation because I do want to show this. So the list class is just a .NET type. Class is just another word for type. You notice here that in the declaration of it, it's list, and then in the angle brackets is T. And down here, we get the explanation that the T is the type of elements in the list. So it's a list of types, but you have to strongly type the list. Let's look at examples here in PowerShell so that it does make sense. So for example, if we want to create a list itself, it doesn't work. You can't find that type. That type doesn't exist because we haven't specified the type correctly. So here on line 61, we can create a list of strings. So we've got system.collection.generic.list, and then we have string, the type itself. And then if we look at the add method, you can see down below we can add, and we specifically can only add strings. You can see down below we got string, and this is, it says we can add with a system.object. Well, let's try that, actually. I'm not sure that'll actually work.
It will, just not as you
it
expect
does.
it.
Does it add it as the...
As a string.
As a string, so it converts it to a string, because all, or not, maybe not all objects, but most objects have the .toString method. Interesting.
Yeah, I know all objects also have to have a toString.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
But yes, that is also why, side note of PowerShell joys and pains, why creating a value from pipeline parameter that is toString can kind of bite you, because if you have a value from pipeline parameter that is toString, anything will pipe into that, whether it was a string or not.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yes, the other part of it is like, because these types are inherited, it's not like you stopped having the ability to add any object to that list. You always had that. That's what iList gave you. You just had new stuff you could do now because you have this generic list that says I can add a string. And in fact, you have that from two different interfaces along the line. A list is a collection, is the short version. So iList has its add, which is generic. iCollection is the generic list of just strings, which has its add, and then the one we're seeing on the actual instance. Sorry, I'm a nerd.
No, and it gets more into, and no, and what I mean is no, thank you. That gets more into the object inheritance. Each type that's inheriting from, you have to implements the same method. Okay, so in line 64, we also do you guessed it, and list of integers, or we can make a list of anything. So Discord REST client, for example, or you really want to get fancy. You want to create a list that'll take any type of object. How do we do that? We do that by creating a list of system.objects. That's 69 here. So we have our list. We have our list, which is empty. We look at the add method, and we can create, add anything to it. We can add our crazy hash table. We can add the client, and we can look at list, and we can see that we've got all these anything, because they all inherit from system.object. So that's a very PowerShell-y focused introduction to generics. But just know that generics can get very complicated. Okay. So last thing. So there's a couple other things that I really just wanted to just to mention, and I'm hoping it was obvious by this point, but when you import a type in PowerShell, you can use it anywhere. You can use it in your functions. You can use it in your interactive scripts. And so, for example, if you use output, so this is an abbreviated function here, lines 4 to 9. You can list it in your output type block. So this is an imported type discord.rest.rest guild. And I know that it will output rest guild because the method I'm using, I've inspected. You can see the output types. And you can also use it as imported types as parameter types as well. And these are just a couple of examples that I just want to make sure that anyone, you guys all understand that .NET types you import them and then you can use them just as any of the types.
Yeah, well, because everything is an object in PowerShell, and those objects are all .NET objects. And every type in PowerShell is a type in .NET, basically.
Yeah. So one of the questions wouldn't. Here, let's go back real quick. All right. Here, I'm actually gonna just copy and paste this on my screen so we can address it. This is a good question. Oh, yeah, crap. All right, so wouldn't. All right, wouldn't these two be functionally equivalent?
Yes and no. For everyday use, yes. Functionally equivalent, sure. The fair fact of it is that there are some parts of .NET that are very old and predate generics, they're generics in .NET. ArrayList is one of them. So it's like essentially saying, if you wanted to use the 20-year-old version of a C++ vector, you probably can. It's probably not going to really hurt you other than performance and less well-maintained technical debt and all that stuff. And that's as far into that flame war as I'll get, but basically they're functionally equivalent, but performance characteristics of the new one are better.
Cool. Yeah, Ryan's saying give some benefits and speed over ArrayList. Yeah, I heard somewhere that generic.list was better. I didn't realize it was because ArrayList was so old. So there you go. Cool.
Yeah, it's a little creaky old. I think it's actually one of the parts of .NET that is V1, but I don't remember. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. So. Cool. Yeah, that's all of the content that I have. I think we go back to the slides, right? There's a clothing slide. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Excellent material, though.
Excellent what?
Thank you.
Excellent material.
Thank you.
Oh, it was much better with the additional commentary and questions. So, thank you guys.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Yeah, so I'll save these files, commit them, and then merge it into the main branch in my sessions repository.
That's
so you guys
awesome.
will have all the updates from tonight.
Cool.
It was weird too because it started out as hey, I know this stuff, no big deal, and then it got into, oh my god, you can do that pretty darn quick.
Yeah, I mean, like, look, I've been around the block many a time, but I try not to assume that I know everything because I love being surprised and finding new information, and you never quite know what little, like, rock you haven't looked under in a while where something new has popped up.
Some great nuggets in there. Yep.
That's why I love user groups and going to the summit and all that good stuff.